Thank you for joining us for another edition of Biotech and Life Sciences CEOs. Over the last 13 editions of this podcast, we've had an opportunity to learn about tiny pill-sized endoscopes, which can be swallowed and controlled on their path through the digestive tract by the healthcare provider. We've heard about the prospects for a universal flu vaccine whose chemistry would be consistent from one year to the next, and whose efficacy could be better than 90%. And a smaller, less expensive tool for targeted genetic sequencing, which could reside in a local hospital setting in underdeveloped countries. And an AI platform to improve and expedite patient selection in clinical trials. And a platform for manufactured biologics, which might be so much cheaper and faster than traditional methods that it could have produced enough COVID vaccine to have inoculated the entire American population within 2 months' time. In other words, things are happening really, really fast. And we'll talk more about that later. But today, our thought is a little different. We're going to try and juxtapose history with what's currently happening in an effort to demonstrate exactly what those changes and how fast those changes are going to be. 160 years ago, America was embroiled in a civil war which, according to the American Battlefield Trust, accounted for 650,000 casualties. That's more than in all other American wars combined up to the time of Vietnam. Of course, healthcare wasn't anything like what it is today, let alone what it may be in 5 to 10 years. But I know that I and probably much of our audience had no idea just how primitive it really was. Today, our guest is Dr. Nicolas Hoffmann. Nick teaches at one of Atlanta's finest private schools, the Marist School, and wrote his PhD thesis on medicine in the Civil War. Nick, how did you become interested in Civil War medicine? And why did you choose it as your PhD thesis?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Part of the thing is when you're in the South, everyone has an opinion on the Civil War. And I knew I couldn't be the old guy at the corner of the convention who could tell you every colonel from every battle. So, as someone with a lot of medical people in my family, I decided to take it in slightly a different direction. There are differences between the North and the South based on medical issues, but medicine is something that affects us all. Outbreaks of disease affect us all, as we just lived through. And so for me, it was kind of an interesting way to tackle a topic which, in some ways, there's more ink spilled on Abraham Lincoln than any other American, more words shared about Gettysburg than almost any other event in American history. So if I could take it to a different angle, I thought it would be interesting. And I started speaking at conventions, historical conventions about it. People approached me. That's how I found my advisor, just by taking this different tack, and it stuck.
Okay, so I understand that prior to the war, humoral theory, where an imbalance in the body's humors, whatever that is, caused illness, and that was kind of the basis of medical practice. Sure. And germs weren't even on the radar. And then the war came, and just as with COVID, necessity kind of became the mother of invention. And of all the changes that occurred, it was kind of the change in mindset from a system that was based on tradition to one that was based on evidence that was the most important. And I guess, maybe no story demonstrates that as well as the strange battle over training nurses and who aids doctors. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So first, I got a physical today, so I know exactly what our medical system is looking like. But like the initials after the name that says if they're a DO or an MD or whatever, that's something that kind of comes about around the Civil War era. Beforehand, there were people called doctors, people like Ben Franklin or Benjamin Rush, if you're a revolutionary person, era person. And they even found hospitals. But doctor is more of an honorary title. The first PhD isn't even given until the 1840s. And so these people who were in the medical field were mostly, think like a medieval guild. They were apprenticed, and then they were trained, just like an internist would be today. And they would go through their hospital rounds up through the ranks until they called themselves doctors. In the North, there were clinics and hospitals and doctors. In the South, it was mostly gentleman farmer types. And so when the war came, we all of a sudden had to scramble to see if any of these credentials mattered at all. And part of that has to do with the fact that in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, there was a for-profit university boom, kind of like we just went through with University of Phoenix and such, and that collapse that happened about 10 years ago. And so there were all sorts of medical schools that had as few as 10 students in them. And then when you were done, you were called doctor. Part of my research effort was to go to the University of Pennsylvania and look through their archives where, records going back to Ben Franklin and the first public hospital are. And even there, a prestigious school that still exists as a medical facility, you would take 4 classes, you would repeat them the next year, and they would call you doctor.
4 classes.
Just 4. It was essentially pharmacopoeia or pharmacy studies, what medicine was. What they call materia medica, which is the tools of medicine. You would take an anatomy and surgery course. And then your 4th class could be an elective. It could be obstetrics. It could be gynecology. It could be an additional surgery section, like to specialize. But you just repeat them a second year. And assuming you passed both times, you could call yourself doctor. And since the standards were very low in some of these other schools, you had hundreds of people calling themselves doctors. And since at the time it was illegal to do an autopsy in most of the country, most of these people hadn't even seen a body. Autopsies that were done in actual schools, Columbia, UPenn, Harvard, they'd be done in a lecture hall with about 200 students. So the doctor who was performing the professor who was performing the work would be on the ground doing everything 3 times so that the people could see. And one of the people I found, William Chapman, who wanted to be a surgeon during the war, but graduated in '66, so just afterwards, has doodles in his notes of these anatomy classes where the professor's literally waving an arm to get attention that he's just amputated to show the students what's going on. So in that fracas, we have to determine who knows anything. The North decides the way to do that is with standardized testing. And you can look up these tests and you can find them. I can send you one for George Snow, who had to talk about anatomy, what kind of painkillers you can use during pregnancy and surgery, even how to tell whether there's an infection. Good stuff. And they'd be judged by a panel of doctors. And if you passed, you were an assistant surgeon, which is a rank in the military. In the South, it was all word of mouth. And, these were gentlemen farmers. Sometimes they usually had a plantation or something, so they gave their medicine away for free. And while they were doing so, they built up a reputation. And if you had a good reputation, people would recommend you to do surgeries, and then you would be given the rank of colonel or whatever. And that would allow the South to build up their ranks. But the South had made a typo in their notes. They had essentially copied the Union military strategy in the South. And so while the North ended up with about 4,000 surgeons, the South only funded 4. And it took about 1.5 years to catch up with that difference because the South always struggled with money and, raising funds for the war itself.
Wow. So the gentlemen farmers, they became doctors because they didn't want to actually fight in the war?
Well, and they were also kind of scientists. They experimented. They were the ones who actually got to practice because they weren't working all day.
Okay. And what about nurses? What was the story with them?
So for nurses, for the most part, the majority were men who were usually very low rank, like privates, and they were just an extra set of hands. You would get a stipend on your salary if you were a nurse for a day. And you can imagine, back then they didn't call it PTSD, they called it nostalgia. But it was horrible, right? These are people who had never been in a medical situation before. They maybe had been sick, but a lot of these are farm boys separated from the World's Fair. And they're dealing with like limbs that are torn apart by soft bullets. And a lot of them can't handle it. And nurses actually had a very large washing out. So there was an effort to get actual trained nurses, people who wouldn't run at the first sign of blood, because it was crucially necessary. And we'll probably get to it. But in a time when anesthetic was new or rare, surgery was often very painful. And if someone's flailing around while you've got a knife over them, accidents happen, and you don't want that. So in the North, there was an effort to get nurses that were trained. The hero of this story is a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. She's the first female MD in the country. Her sister Sarah is the third female MD in this country. She sets up schools, mostly in New York, to train nurses and trains thousands of women in medical procedure, and is considered very good at it. But the problem is she doesn't have a lot of power. The woman who's in charge is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, who, for those of you who know your American history, she's also responsible for creating the asylum system. Before the mentally ill were essentially just chained to walls. And the hospital system in prisons. Beforehand, prison, there was something like 160 things that could lead to execution in the US. She got it down to 4 and created prisons. So for that, Dorothea Dix gets a gold star. But when she visits the South, she didn't have a problem with slavery. So when they were looking for someone to be in charge of nurses, she was a less politically delicate choice as opposed to the Blackwell family from Massachusetts, who were very anti-slavery. Well, Dorothea Dix was a very religious person. And so she didn't want young, attractive nurses distracting the male soldiers. This leads to her rejecting more than 10,000 nurses that were desperately needed. George McClellan called her Dragon Dix because of this. Elizabeth Blackwell called her a self-sealing can of hatred tied up with red tape. Now, all these trained nurses who wanted to help, and you have this woman who's the first head of a federal bureaucracy as a woman, rejecting them. This causes chaos in the ranks. Generals would select the nurses regardless of what Dick said. And then a young Clara Barton sees all these surplus nurses and uses them to found the Red Cross. Yeah, it all comes together. There's also some Catholics involved, Sisters of Charity and Sisters of Mercy, come out of their convents. They're trained nurses and they help the battlefield. At one point, McClellan himself says, I would take a dozen of these nuns over 100 of the nurses trained by Dorothea. This builds his reputation for the Catholic nurses up north and in the South. There's just not as many Catholics in the South. The South has a different crisis altogether. First, the people directly helping the surgeons are generally their slaves, personal servants, which turns out in the end is a good thing because when the Freedmen's Bureau sets up black hospitals in the South, those are the only African Americans with medical training. And they become some of the first doctors in the South to be helping purely African Americans in hospitals. But the rest of it, they never have a good program in place to really train nurses to the same degree as in the North. And so a lot of the people helping at what they call the wayside hospitals, the hospitals set up in towns around the railroad lines, unfortunately, they're just normal housewives without any training and any supplies, doing the best they can in cities like Roswell and Atlanta and down the coast of Sherman's March to the Sea.
Wow. So let's talk about kind of the elephant in the room now, something that almost everyone knows about, the amputations and the prosthetics. You can't talk about either one, I don't think, without also talking about anesthesia.
Sure.
So I guess anesthesia prompted the explosion in amputations. They were just exploded in the Civil War from what it was in the Mexican-American War, I guess. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, as you can imagine, amputation is a very traumatic event to the body. And it's generally, even today when it happens, which still happens, it's a last resort because the body has to adjust. It's a very traumatic to the organs and such. And people have been considering it for a long time. It makes sense. And amputations have been happening for generations. In fact, the first amputation we found successfully done is more than 4,000 years old. So the question is, how do we do it on this scale? As you mentioned, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 660,000. Some numbers have it as high as 700,000 dead during the war. There's estimates as high as 400,000 amputations. And you mentioned the Mexican-American War, which happens in the 1840s. only 4 were successfully done. And they were put in formaldehyde and shipped in jars back to Philadelphia for study. They're still at the Modern Museum. You can see them.
Wow.
So how do we scale up something so dramatic and so terrifying? Well, again, like I imagine a lot of you out there in TV land have had some sort of surgery. I've had my tonsils and adenoids out. I've messed up my knee. It's very common. Most of it's outpatient, laparoscopic in the joints, and you barely feel it. A few weeks of PT and you're back to normal. Back then, it was so traumatic that there was somewhere, New York estimated there was about a 30% suicide rate over having surgery. Big hospitals in downtown Manhattan, like near Columbia University, would put their operating theater on the top floor so people couldn't hear the yelling from the street. And this, when you're thinking of nurses, don't think of women in white smocks. Think of Bond villains just literally holding people into place in an effort to make sure that the surgery could be done as quickly and as cleanly as possible. And these things were spectacles. There was even the story of the fastest knife in the West coming out of Edinburgh, and he could do a leg amputation in 2 minutes and 15 seconds. And he would have people time him, and it would be an entertainment for all. And so if you want to be a doctor, you're paying for tickets to watch this happen. And like you mentioned, everything changes in the mid-1840s with anesthetic. And again, I just can't imagine someone going with a knife towards my neck without any sort of anesthetic, but there you have it, right? The first kind of anesthetics that we talk about generally, there's nitrous oxide, which was discovered as kind of, it's a waste gas produced by chemical reaction. And you would have what were called nitrous frolics, where people would get on stage on laughing gas, and they would just start playing music, and these people who were kind of drugged out of their mind would dance around. And we started having stories of people like falling off the stage, breaking their leg in half, and then keep trying to dance because they didn't feel the pain. And someone eventually was like, hey, science. And they started using it mostly in dental surgery. But the idea of doing any sort of bodily surgery with it was experimented. However, the real gold star happens with ether, diethyl ether, which again had been discovered before, but is generally fairly unstable, even though you can buy it on Amazon, so don't you worry. But the idea being that we knock someone out, they kind of lose consciousness, they lose that feeling. We can do surgery with someone who's effectively comatose temporarily, and they're not going to be thrashing around. The first public demonstration of this was done by a guy named William Morton, who wanted credit so badly that there's literally an ether battle over who actually does it first. Morton, kind of goes off the deep end in an attempt to prove that he's the most significant case early on. He uses ether on himself and does surgery so often that it essentially causes him to have nitrous bubbles in his brain. He goes crazy in New York and starts stabbing people, dies in a hospital or dies in a prison overnight, essentially bleeding to death. Right. But as a Georgia boy, done good. Crawford Long is given credit for actually first using ether during surgery. And if you go to Washington, D.C., he's one of the statues we have in the Congress's Statuary Hall for saving lives thanks to the invention of ether. Now, on the battlefield, what that means is theoretically, you would be given the Surgeon General did experiments, what the proper proportion of all these things should be. And he found that an equal proportion of chloroform, which causes consciousness to be lost, and ether in equal combination would block the pain and keep the person out for about 15 minutes. In the North, we have the industrial facilities to do that. In the South, we don't. And so very quickly, there are shortages specifically of the chloroform, which is harder to synthesize. And so in the South, they would mix the ether with whiskey. And you'd have a dangerous drop in blood pressure oftentimes, because that's something blood does with alcohol. It thins, and they would bleed out. Wow. But that leads to hundreds of thousands of amputations done. I've been part of archaeological digs near Kennesaw where you just find arms. And, it saves lives. But the stat I always give is in 1868, literally a third of Mississippi's entire state budget was for artificial limbs for those in the Confederacy.
Wow. Wow. So I guess I read about a Confederate soldier named James Hanger who designed a prosthetic leg for himself with rubber bumpers on the ankle and a rubber foot. And that kind of became, I guess, the standard thereafter. Is that right?
That's right.
So these people were sort of doing it themselves, I guess, right? There was no prosthetic industry, if you will. There was no Zimmer around at that time.
Well, like you were saying, it's tragedy is the mother of invention oftentimes. And, you know, in the South, just think of the crisis, right? Slaves are freed, which is good. But roughly 30% of their workforce is white, poor farmers who are often injured or have PTSD. And so these people who lost a limb still have to return to the farm. Without artificial limbs, like the entire workforce is gone. The South collapses. So you make do with what you can. And you have a lot of interesting stories like that. And you're right, he becomes the standard all the way up through World War One. And then we have other people who are fiddling around nationwide. I mean, you really are thinking of like old pictures of the Golden Age of pirates where someone just kind of has a stump, and he figures out a way to make an articulated limb, which is incredible.
Wow. And then I guess because they weren't conversant with the importance of cleanliness in surgery, that there were two ways to kind of close up the wound. You could just sort of leave it alone and clean it up every day, and that was the safest. The most dangerous was to use a flap of skin and close it up, because that would close all the dirt inside or all the germs inside, and it would get infected and they'd die. Right?
Yeah, pretty much. And again, for those of you out there in radio land who are interested, there's a series of books put out by the US government called The Medical and Surgical History of the War of Rebellion. And it's literally every surgical case, every illness that the entire North had that they had documents on. It gets published in 1868, and it's 12 volumes long. And you can read, like, Tim, what you're talking about. They literally had the numbers because they looked into every surgery they could get good numbers on and said, he died, he didn't. Why did he die? Well, this thing. And so that feeds the evidence for germ theory, that feeds standard practice. And one of the things we get because of this is standard medical practice. You know, if a good doctor has to do some improvisation. There's artistry. It's not just all straightforward following a checklist. But we start with that checklist, and this is where it starts to come together.
And then I guess they kind of luck upon the importance of cleanliness because they had to, I don't know if this was in the North or the South, but they had to reuse bandages.
They did.
And so the people that had the first bandage never reused, they died because the wound wasn't cleaned prior to putting the bandage on. But then someone that got a reused bandage, which was cleaned prior to the reuse, they lived. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just exactly the opposite of what you would think might happen, right? I don't want a reused bandage. You know, how do you know they cleaned it well?
Right.
But it's just strange. And then I guess also, for the first time, people had to be transported in large numbers from the field to a real hospital. Mm-hmm. And so ambulances are kind of invented, if you want to use that word.
Yeah, pretty much. So the big guy there is a man named John Letterman. In fact, he is given free reign pretty much to see what he can do to save lives. And he comes up with what we call the system of triage for the military, which of course gets modified every time there's a crisis, but it starts with Letterman. But yeah, so he has ambulances and you set up the system. Can you walk on your own? Can this wound be treated, or is this person just going to bleed out? And, you know, when you're in the middle of a major battle, something like Gettysburg, you need to be able to distribute medicine to those who can be saved. and those who can't are put lower on the list. It's a tragedy of it. And then you can get people from the battlefield to the battlefield hospitals, which are usually a few hundred yards behind the lines, and they're treating people. That's also around where the Red Cross would set up, and they'd be helping both sides. And when they were stable, quote unquote stable, they could be put on a boat and sent to military hospitals across the country. And those are the big ones that still, that had the historical markers. They're in every state. There was a big one outside Cincinnati. The legends, though it's probably not this bad, but before the war, there was about 20 to 50,000 people in DC. But during the height of the war, there were so many wounded that there was almost 500,000. Numbers are probably closer to 250,000. But like Walt Whitman, the famous poet, went to DC to look for his brother who was wounded. And it took him 4 days because he would just have to go to one group of tents and ask, and go to another group of tents and ask, because there was just so many people. But what that tells you is they were able to get people stabilized and get them to an actual pavilion hospital hundreds of miles away from the battlefield where they started, which means they were stable. A lot of them had a better chance of surviving. And that doesn't mean that, they didn't get infections later on, but it meant that they knew what they were doing. Now, some of these people could be at the battlefield hospital for months before they were evacuated.
Yeah.
But it did let them, there was a procedure in place and that allowed them to survive.
And so I get like at Camp Letterman, they were treating Confederate and Union soldiers side by side. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So what was Letterman's status? Was he a
Well, early in the war, he started out essentially as a quartermaster, and he was distributing supplies. And, a good engineer type, he realizes that the way that they were distributing them was not the efficient way to do it. So he starts coming up with a guide for his own medical officers to look at, here's what we need to do with these supplies. Because remember, we kind of alluded to this, but medical supplies at the time were a few bandages, maybe a tourniquet, and then a hot cup of coffee to keep them going long enough to get in line for surgery. And if you had your arm to be amputated, you were probably holding that arm, standing in line outside the hospital tent. And so, what Letterman was looking at was, let's see how to make this better. And as his methods proved effective, by the time we're in the last couple of years of the war, he earns the rank of major, then eventually general, though he never does anything in terms of like military strategy you'd associate with a general. He's the major in charge of medical facilities of the war.
What happens to him after the war?
He goes into hospital service, and he starts maintaining hospitals around the country.
Okay.
So his own manual becomes standard text, which is kind of neat.
And then I guess that it wasn't always battle wounds that kind of confounded Civil War medicine. The Battle of Vicksburg, I guess, turns not so much on strategy, but on malaria.
Totally. And we like, of the men of the war, right? I mentioned the book already, but there were something like 20 million illnesses for just the Union side in the 4 years that were the war, leading to the death of nearly 240,000 people before they even set foot on the battlefield. And another 400,000 were released because they were too sick to fight. And things like bad water, dysentery, wreck the ranks constantly. But one of the places we see it most clearly is Vicksburg. Now, for those of you who are rusty on the war, the first plan that the U.S., the North, the Union, had for winning the war was come up with by Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican-American War, called the Anaconda Plan. They would surround the South, blockading it on the ocean and on the Gulf, and then taking the Mississippi River, and then the idea would be to just squeeze. So cities like New Orleans, taken fairly early on. Parts of the coast across the Gulf, taken pretty early on. But the last holdout on the Mississippi was the fort of Vicksburg. It's an elevated fort, and the Mississippi River is notorious for flooding its banks, being filled with mosquitoes, and just generally kind of gruesome. And this is awful, fighting in it. I mean, it's like fighting in a swamp. You're up to your knees, oftentimes in mud. There's bugs everywhere. And we knew that people who were in swamps often got sick. You referred earlier to miasmic theory, essentially that bad smells can carry diseases. And honestly, it's half right. It's not the smells, though, that carry the diseases. It's the thing that cause the smells that cause diseases. But the fetid water of the swampy areas of the Mississippi, they thought caused malaria. We now know it's the mosquitoes. But to keep the malaria away is a drug now based on quinine. Quinine is an extract from a bark that we get from Latin America. And you steep it kind of like tea and consume it. My own great uncle was a cardinal in the Belgian Congo. He had malaria and had to drink quinine daily till he died. Like it's one of those things. Wow. So just imagine the Battle of Vicksburg ends on the 4th of July, 1863, the same day that Gettysburg ends. So just imagine you're in mid-June in the heat of the Deep South in the swamps around the Mississippi River. And every morning they want you to take a nice steaming cup, about 12 ounces, of quinine. Now, quinine is very bitter, and for some reason it works better with alcohol. So you would have a cauldron of whiskey boiling with the quinine in it, and it's about 90 degrees first thing in the morning, and you're drinking a steaming cup of whiskey. And we know this, you know this, because quinine becomes the quintessential ingredient in something called tonic water, which the Brits enjoy with their gin. Right. Which is also believed to have anti-inflammatory. Juniper has anti-inflammatory qualities. So a gin and tonic was a treatment for malaria. And so we Americans, of course, use good bourbon whiskey, heat it up. But, people didn't want to drink it. They didn't drink enough, or the concentration wasn't good. With these non-pharmaceutical medications, things like aspirin, the chemical often sinks to the bottom. The boiling helps, but if you're not drinking the whole thing, it's like taking only half of your antibiotic. You're not getting the full dose. And so a lot of the Union Army gets really, really sick with malaria. Now, malaria is one of those things. It either kills you or it's with you for the rest of your life. It's a protozoan disease. It hides in the body. You can have fevers as high as 104 and you're laid out. And then if it kills you, it kills you. But if it doesn't, it might go away for a day, a week, months, years even. But you always have it in your system. So Grant is looking at his army and they're not moving. If you have a general and you have an army and they're not moving, it's a waste of materials, it's a waste of everything, and they're dying in the hot summer sun from malaria. Well, around the end of June, all of a sudden, the men who have malaria start getting better. They go into a dormant phase and they start to improve. And so Grant decides, hell, this is my chance. Let's make a march up the hill. Because for some reason, the Confederates stopped firing as much. So he says, double whammy, I've got more men and they must be low on ammo. Turns out that the heavy rains had driven the mosquitoes up the hill. And so the Confederates were down about 45% of their troops due to this malaria outbreak as well. And Grant wins probably the most important battle of his middle career because of a malaria outbreak that his men had survived and the Confederates were then in the throes of. With that, we win the Mississippi River as the Union Army, and the final squeeze for the South can happen. Grant is selected as the head of all Union forces so he can start his march to the sea and his direct engagement with Robert E. Lee. And all that happens because of a mosquito, which is a hell of a thing.
Yeah, it goes to the say, I guess, it's better to be lucky than smart.
Yeah. Because again, any other month, he would have been the same U.S. Grant, but without the luck.
Right. Wow. So then there are the, I guess, crazy events after the assassinations of Lincoln and Garfield, where I guess Garfield is essentially killed not by the assassination but by his doctors.
Sure. Yeah, the whole tale, so I'll get to the good part first, and just say, in the end, it turns out what we eat matters. American diets before the Civil War, throughout the war, is just awful. I'm sure you'll have nutritionists on, and just America, gastroenteritis was called the American disease. We ate preserved pork roughly 3 times a day with black coffee and drank almost no water. Alcohol started around age 6. It was just not a good place to live. And if you're living in a part of the country like the South, we do have a lot of fruits and vegetables. But if you're living on the frontier, like Wisconsin, it's not like you have fruits and veggies year round. So diet was terrible. Out of this comes religion. And this ties everything together. Trust me, I'm not as crazy as I look. There's a guy named William Miller. He doesn't matter much. He founds the Seventh-day Adventists, but he believes that the end of the world is coming. And that in order to be good Christians ready for God to come take us away, we should not drink as much. We should consume things like water, and we should eat fruits and vegetables. In fact, he pushed for vegetarianism. The idea of veganism really didn't exist in America at the time. Well, after an event called the Great Disappointment, turned out the world didn't end. But a lot of people kept up with what now is the Seventh-day Adventists, including one reverend, a guy by the name of Sylvester Graham. Now, Graham pushed as an advocate for a vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, in fact. He had people drink milk and water and juice when you could get it, but no alcohol, completely clean living, so to speak. And he even blamed things like cholera outbreaks on eating too much pork in Asia. So he comes up with a kind of bread that he recommended people eat with a mixture of wheat germ, whole grain, and flour that he called graham crackers. And the graham cracker movement explodes around his church, which happens to be in Battle Creek, Michigan. Now, women start to follow him, and it has to do with the fact that at the time alcoholism was associated with spousal abuse. And so he has all these women around him all the time, and he's abstinent, and they are anti-meat, and this cult starts to appear around him, which leads to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which I'll get to in a second. Now, this is important if only one of the spurned husbands works for something called the National Biscuit Company, Nabisco. And because his wife ran off to join the Grahamites, he takes Graham's sacred cracker and adds cursed honey and cursed cinnamon to make graham crackers owned by Nabisco, just to spite the bastard. But that's kind of the one side of it. I mention it because the other side of the Seventh-day Adventists forms a group called the Oneida community. William Noyes has it's a commune where people live, they eat, they practice the vegetarianism. And some of these people end up in the Union Army. And they're the reason why things like vegetables are introduced to the Union Army to help with eyesight. They're introduced to cleaner water. And it's designed, now it doesn't always work. Obviously, dysentery and cholera still spread, but it's an attempt. And they also push for being outside. So we have these big open air hospitals where people are encouraged to walk and to get fresh air, all of which are good things in convalescence. Now, I mentioned all of these things because these are how you get crazy people involved in stories. Charles Guiteau is a man who is clearly mentally disturbed. He goes down in history as a disgruntled office seeker. But at the age of 8, when his mother dies, he and his father go off to join the Oneida community because it's a free love society, and his dad was disappointed. Yeah. What happens is, over time, I mean, and it's a good, long, crazy story, but Guiteau gets kicked out in what's called a shame circle, where they strip him naked and yell insults at him, which is totally fine for the mental health of a young boy. But he shows up at the University of Michigan. He didn't apply. He just wants to start taking classes, where he's kicked out again. And every time he's ostracized, he believes that there's a higher purpose for him. He gets involved with the Republican Party, where he believes that the Republicans are the right party. U.S. Grant will be president forever. And then when Grant doesn't run, he decides that James Garfield will be president forever. James Garfield is a Civil War general. He was from Ohio. He's a war hero. He had 3 horses shot out from underneath him.
Incidentally, it's from my hometown.
Oh, no kidding. That's fun.
And we went to the same college as well. So there you go. But when I was a kid, yes, we would take little field trips to his house. It was called Longfield. Still,
yeah.
So,
very good.
Yeah, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, you're fine. But I mean, by all accounts, Garfield was a good guy. He wanted to clean up the corruption after the Grant administration. But Guiteau was convinced, because he gave one speech to 20 African Americans, that he had earned Garfield his presidential term. Again, crazy guy. So he starts writing these letters dozens and dozens of letters saying like, I got you the presidency, so I'd like to be the ambassador to Paris or to Vienna. At one point, the Secretary of State literally grabs him by the collar and says, you have to stop writing these letters. So he writes another letter. And eventually he goes to, he's in New York at the time, and he goes to a shop to, quote, buy a gun that would look good in a museum, which is something you should tell someone about. But when Garfield comes through on the train station, Guiteau at first doesn't want to shoot him because his wife is with him. But on the way back through town, he shoots Garfield twice, once to the wrist and once just below the kidney on the right side in his back. And, Garfield is wounded. Charles Guiteau is arrested. And when Guiteau is arrested, he's like, they hold on to him because if the president lives, it's an attempted murder. If the president dies, it's murder. And Garfield is, he's in fairly good health. He had a bullet lodged in him, but that wasn't uncommon at the time. But they want the best damn medical treatment available because he's the president of the United States. And so over the course of weeks, literally like 4 weeks, he's poked and poked and poked and poked. Now, this is a Bulldog 44 caliber bullet. So it's a little bit smaller than half an inch. But over the course of those weeks, people poke and prod and look for the bullet so much that the wound appears to have grown to almost 2 inches in diameter. And even the young Alexander Graham Bell, fresh off of the telephone, comes up with a metal detector. But all it does is detect the bed springs. So they do all these extra surgeries in the poor man's back. And his health would improve and it would decline. It would improve and then it would decline. And the day he dies, he had just written to his mother to say he's getting better. The nation mourns, except for the Democratic newspapers who say, Congress is out of session, the president is dead, we are better without either of them. And they mourn him, but now Guiteau is a murderer. For the first time in American legal history, the McNaughton defense, or not guilty by reason of insanity, is used. It is worth noting that Guiteau didn't want to use it, his lawyers did, so he fired them all and defended himself, which is a case I would love to hear. Apparently, he broke into song and improvised a 20-minute song on the witness stand, and they condemned him to death anyway. At which point, he writes to the vice president, now the president, Chester Arthur, and says, "Dear sir, you've gotten a promotion. And as a thank you, I want you to pardon me." But yeah, so that's kind of the death of Garfield and the creation of graham crackers. It is worth note that his congregation, in his congregation were the Kellogg brothers, who found the Kellogg Sanitarium, who invent breakfast cereal as a Grahamite treat, right? It's vegan, it's natural. And the Kellogg Sanitarium, which existed up into the 1940s, was a place where presidents, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford would go to have a wellness cure and to eat some breakfast cereal. So there you go.
Wow. What of all these stories, Nick, what is your favorite story?
I do comedy around here, and you just lean into the audience. Like some people really do love to hear about how breakfast cereal was created accidentally, and that they refused to patent it because it was medicine and they wanted to be able to give it for medicinal purposes. So a guy named William Post, who founded Post breakfast cereals, just steals the idea and makes Raisin Bran. Like, that's too good not to tell them.
You can't make that up, can you?
No, you can't. But in general, like, for me, the stories that work are the human elements. Like, before the war, there's this big philosophical debate as to where the soul is. Is the soul something physical? Is it in our body that escapes? Is it that mystical 22 grams that we get or not? So when Stonewall Jackson loses an arm, they give his arm a full military burial because, again, until even recently, the Catholics didn't want to be cremated. They believed that the whole body had to be resurrected on the last day. So the arm, with its rank on its sleeve, was buried just outside of Chancellorsville. And then when the rest of him died, they gave it a second burial. So he was buried in two places with proper military, like, rank and privilege.
He wasn't buried next to the arm.
No, it's two separate memorials. Even today, it's two separate memorials.
Wow. That's just wild. That is just wild. What would you say is the most important innovation that grew out of the Civil War period?
I would say first, as far as individual innovations go, it's kind of hard because most medical innovations don't come out of the blue. They build on top of decades of knowledge to improve over time. But I would say just as a concept, the public hospital. Hospitals used to be a place where people went to die, specifically the poor. If you were rich, the doctors would come to your home and they would treat you there. You would even have surgeries done on like the kitchen table. But like, just think about the numbers you threw out at the beginning. At the time, we had roughly 33 million people in America. So about half, 16 million were men, 16 million were women, somewhere there. 3.5 million were slaves in the South. So we're talking about like 15 million men across the country. 660,000 die.
Wow.
That's like 1 in 25. And that's of all ages. Most of the men fighting in military age were between the ages of 16 and 35. So we're talking about a very narrow part of the population with incredibly high casualty. And if you take that into consideration, how many illnesses, how many surgeries were done, the military hospital might be the most common shared experience of all Americans in that era. And the comfort that suddenly Americans have where, oh, the hospital's not just a place where poor people go to die, it's where I can go to get better. That mindset, that huge shift is massive. And the idea that then in Cincinnati, the hospital being built is not just for the poor, it's where everyone goes. That makes a huge just emotional difference. And the idea of that being an innovation makes sense to me. The after effects kind of spiral from that. Well, clearly people who are given the clean water and the clean like bandages and the clean equipment did better. So why don't we just try cleaning up society? Right?
Give it a shot.
Yeah, why not? So there's a guy named Colonel George Waring, who was a colonel in the Union Army, lives in New York City, which was filthy. And he's like, why don't we bury the sewage? Why don't we have sewer lines? Why don't we build a public park in these tenements, which become Central Park, built by Olmsted? He would dress his garbage men in all white. And then if the uniforms came back dirty, he'd send them back out again. And like the life expectancy in New York went up by almost a decade over decade. Just because, again, clean water, clean air, right? The people you talk about are doing cutting edge, incredibly important stuff. But one of the reasons I would never go back in time is clean water, hot water, the ability to bathe regularly. That is incredibly important, crucial. You know, antibiotics aside, just being able to wash is something that is developed. They're like, oh, this made a difference. Let's modernize the cities. And cities suddenly become a place that's healthier than the countryside, which wasn't always the case.
Interesting. You know, necessity, I guess, truly is the mother of invention. And innovation's always been met with skepticism. It's as true today as it was in 1860. I thought I'd kind of close with part of a recent article from Endpoints. It said, for decades, MIT professor Robert Langer believed scientists could deliver large molecules, such as RNA, through tiny particles to treat a range of diseases. When he told a group of senior scientists about his ideas for drug delivery at a Chinese restaurant in 1979, one of them blew cigar smoke in his face. You better start looking for another job, the scientist said. After about 200 or 300 failures, Langer's team had already proved the idea could work in a 1976 paper published in Nature. Still, he faced a string of rejected grants, and skepticism. His research on drug delivery, which led him to co-found Moderna in 2010, went on to prove critical in developing the company's COVID-19 vaccine. Once again, necessity proceeded and indeed pressured the release of much of that skepticism. Our premise is that the simultaneous coming of age of big data stimulating artificial intelligence, low-cost genetic sequencing and editing, and RNA technology will, over the next decade, create more advancements in healthcare than has been seen combined over the last 160 years since the Civil War. Our next episode will review and, most importantly, update the progress of our guests of the last 13 months. My guess is that the audience will be amazed and impressed by that progress, and that this may crystallize for them more than ever their understanding of how incredible, how fast all of this is happening. And so I hope you'll join us for that episode. Nick, I'd like to thank you for what has been certainly our most entertaining episode thus far. And thank you for your patience and willingness to help us juxtapose history with the future. So thank you very much again. And I look forward to everyone seeing the episode.
Well, Tim, thanks for having me. And whenever you want me to come back and talk medical history, I'd be happy to do it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Life Sciences and Biotech Podcast. We'll see you in the next episode. The information contained in this website and podcast are purely informational and not considered investment recommendations. Tim Dougherty's participation in Biotech Insights is separate and apart from his role as an investment advisor representative. Nothing contained herein can be construed as a recommendation or endorsement of any of the companies discussed. Tim Dougherty also has no financial affiliation with any of the companies mentioned in this communication. Tim Dougherty makes no representation that the information contained in this material is accurate and is under no obligation to update this information as changes occur.